Get out of that seat right now. The voice boomed through the cabin like a gunshot, echoing off the sleek, curved walls of the Boeing 787's first-class section. Captain Sterling Vance stood in the aisle, his face a deep, mottled purple, his finger trembling as he pointed it directly at the woman sitting in 1A. He didn't care that the boarding process was still underway or that other wealthy passengers were staring. He only saw a young black woman in a sharp red suit holding a leather-bound book, and in his mind, she was a stain on the luxury he presided over. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, his chest puffing out beneath his 4 gold stripes. Kiana Mckenzie didn't look up immediately. She slowly turned the page of her book, her fingers steady, her expression as calm as a deep lake in midwinter. The silence she maintained only seemed to drive the captain into a deeper state of hysteria. Beside him, a woman in a shimmering silver dress and a heavy faux fur wrap let out a loud, theatrical sigh. This was Chloe Davenport, a social media influencer known more for her tantrums than her content, and she was currently filming the entire encounter with a gold-plated smartphone. Chloe tossed her blonde hair and sneered, leaning into the captain's space to ensure she got the perfect angle of Kiana's face. "Did you hear the captain?" "This is my seat," Chloe whined, her voice high and grating. "I paid for the premium experience, not to sit behind someone who probably won't even appreciate the vintage champagne. Sterling, do something. I'm losing light for my live stream and this person is ruining the vibe of my entire trip to London." Captain Vance nodded aggressively, his jaw set in a hard line. "You heard her. You're in the wrong section, honey. I don't know how you slipped past the gate agents, but first class is for people who can actually afford the ticket. Now, move your bags to the back of the plane before I have air marshals drag you off in handcuffs." He reached out, his hand hovering inches from Kiana's shoulder, a gesture of pure intimidation that made the passengers in the rows behind them gasp. But before we do, if you want to be entered in our video shout-out giveaway, simply subscribe now, then comment "I subbed" and you will be entered. This video's shout-out giveaway goes to Edward Patrick from Tennessee. Thanks for being part of the family and supporting. Now, it's time to get back into the story. Kiana finally closed her book. She looked up, her dark eyes locking onto the captain's with a level of intensity that made him momentarily flinch. There was no fear in her gaze, only a cold, clinical observation of a man destroying his own career. She didn't move an inch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply adjusted the silk scarf around her neck and spoke with a clarity that cut through the captain's bravado. "My ticket says 1A, Captain Vance," Kiana said, her voice smooth and melodic. "And unless the tail number of this aircraft has changed in the last 20 minutes, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. Perhaps you should spend more time checking your flight path and less time acting as a bouncer for seats you don't own." The captain let out a harsh, mocking laugh, looking around at the other passengers for support. "You think you're smart? I've been flying for 30 years. I know who belongs in this cabin and who doesn't. You've got 5 seconds to stand up, or I'm declaring you a flight risk and diverting this plane before we even taxi." Chloe cackled in the background, zooming in on Kiana's face, waiting for the tears or the outburst that would go viral. But Kiana just reached into her small handbag and pulled out a black card with a gold crest that none of them recognized. "Call your ground supervisor, Sterling. Tell him the owner of the tail number is sitting in 1A and she's requesting a crew evaluation immediately." Kiana's words were a cold bucket of water over the captain's head. His smirk didn't vanish, but it flickered for a fraction of a second. He looked at the card, then back at her red suit, which he now realized cost more than his monthly salary. He shook his head, refusing to let reality penetrate his bias. He snatched the card from her hand, barely looking at it before shoving it back at her. "I don't care what kind of fake credit card you have," Vance spat, his voice dropping to a dangerous hiss. "I run this metal tube. My word is law. You are moving to 42F, or you are going to jail. Pick one." He turned to the lead flight attendant, a nervous man named Terrence who was hovering nearby. "Terrence, get the zip ties. We have a non-compliant passenger who thinks she owns the place." Terrence looked at Kiana, then at the captain, his face pale. "Sir, maybe we should just double-check the manifest one more time?" There was a late addition to the VIP list from the corporate office. "I don't give a damn about a manifest," Vance roared, turning his fury on his subordinate. "I see what's in front of me. Now do your job." Chloe Davenport stepped forward, her phone inches from Kiana's nose. "Ooh, look at her trying to act all big. Are you gonna cry now? Say something for the fans, sweetie. Tell them how it feels to get kicked out of the big leagues." Kiana didn't cry. She stood up, but not to move to the back. She stood to her full height, her presence suddenly filling the cabin in a way that made the air feel thin. She didn't look at Chloe. She looked past the captain, straight at the cockpit door. "Terrence, since the captain is currently suffering from a lapse in professional judgment, Please open the satellite link to Skybound Holdings. Tell them Kiana Mckenzie is on the line. The name hit the captain like a physical blow. Skybound Holdings was the parent company that had purchased the airline 3 months ago in a massive multi-billion-dollar takeover. The name of the new CEO had been kept quiet, whispered about in boardrooms but never seen on the front lines. Vance's hand went to his collar, suddenly finding it far too tight. You're lying. That's a common name. You're just some girl playing dress-up. I'm the girl who signed the check for your pension fund last week, Sterling, Kiana said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than his shout. And right now, I'm looking at a massive liability in a pilot's uniform. Just then, the intercom crackled to life, but it wasn't the usual pre-flight announcement. A panicked voice from the flight deck came through the speakers, loud enough for the whole first-class cabin to hear. Captain Vance? Sterling? We just got an emergency override from the CEO's office. They're saying the owner is on board and we're to cease all operations until she's verified. Sterling, where are you? The color drained from Captain Vance's face so fast he looked like he might faint. He looked at Kiana, then at the intercom, then at Chloe, who had finally lowered her phone, her mouth hanging open. The silence in the cabin was deafening, broken only by the sound of Kiana's phone vibrating in her hand. She answered it on the first ring, putting it on speaker. Ms. Mckenzie, a voice boomed. It was the director of operations from the airline's headquarters. We just tracked your biometric check-in. Is there a problem on Flight 402? We're seeing a delay in the cabin door closure. Kiana kept her eyes fixed on Vance. Yes, Arthur. It seems we have a security issue. Captain Sterling Vance has decided that my presence in first class is a breach of aesthetic. He's currently threatening to zip-tie the owner of his company because he doesn't like the color of my suit, or perhaps, the color of the person in it. The voice on the other end went stone cold. He did what? Sterling Vance is still on the aircraft? He is, Kiana said. And he's accompanied by a passenger, a Ms. Chloe Davenport, who is currently filming a private corporate matter for her social media. I'd like the legal team to prepare an injunction for that footage immediately. Chloe let out a small, strangled squeak and tried to hide her phone behind her back, her silver dress crinkling as she began to tremble. Captain Vance took a step back, his hand searching for the seatback to steady himself. I was just following protocol, he stammered, his bravado replaced by a pathetic, whining tone. I thought the seat was double-booked. It was a misunderstanding, ma'am. A simple mistake. A mistake is a wrong turn on a taxiway, Sterling, Kiana said, stepping out into the aisle. What you did was an exercise in ego and prejudice. You didn't even look at my ticket. You saw me, and you decided I was less than. You told me I belonged in the back. You told me I didn't appreciate the luxury. Well, the luxury belongs to me. This plane belongs to me. And as of this moment, your wings belong to the scrap heap. Arthur's voice came back over the line. Ms. Mckenzie, we have the airport police and the relief crew standing by. We can have Vance removed in 5 minutes. How would you like to proceed? Kiana looked at the crowd of passengers. They were all watching, some with cameras, some with looks of pure shock. She looked at Chloe, who was now crying real tears, her influencer mask completely shattered. Then she looked back at Vance, who looked like a broken man. Don't bring the police yet, Arthur, Kiana said. I want him to walk off this plane in front of everyone. But first, he's going to make an announcement. Get on the PA, Sterling, Kiana commanded, gesturing toward the handset near the galley. The captain moved like a zombie, his feet dragging. He reached for the phone, his fingers fumbling with the cord. He looked at the passengers, his eyes red and brimming with shame. He had spent his life being the king of the sky, and now he was being humbled in front of the very people he had tried to impress. He keyed the mic, his breath hitching. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Vance. I would like to apologize for the delay. There was a situation in the cabin. I would like to specifically apologize to the passenger in seat 1A. I acted unprofessionally. I made assumptions that were wrong and offensive. Keep going, Kiana prompted, her arms crossed over her chest. I am being relieved of my command, Vance continued, his voice breaking. A new flight crew will be taking over shortly. I am sorry for the inconvenience to your travel plans. He hung up the handset and leaned his forehead against the wall, a sob escaping his throat. Kiana turned her attention to Chloe Davenport. The influencer was trying to shrink into the shadows of the galley, her silver sequins catching the light in a way that now felt garish and cheap. And you, Kiana said. The woman who was worried about her vibe. You think that because you have followers, you have the right to humiliate people for sport? I was just joking. Chloe sobbed, her makeup running down her face in dark streaks. It was just a prank for the gram. I didn't know who you were. I'll delete it. I'll post a public apology. I'll tag you. You'll do more than that, Kiana said. You're going to give your phone to Terrence. Our legal team will ensure that every second of that footage is archived as evidence for the civil suit I'm filing against you for harassment. And after that, you're going to be escorted off this plane. You won't be flying skybound ever again. In fact, I'll make sure your name is shared with every major carrier in the alliance. Please. Chloe wailed, dropping to her knees on the cabin carpet. My whole career is travel. If I can't fly, I have nothing. Then I guess you'll have a lot of time to find a new vibe on the bus, Kiana remarked. Terrence stepped forward, his face set in a firm mask, and held out his hand for the phone. Chloe handed it over like it was a piece of her own heart. Kiana turned back to the cabin, where the ground crew was already entering the jet bridge. The airport police marched in, their boots thudding on the floor. They didn't head for Kiana. They headed straight for Vance and Chloe. As Vance was led away, his head bowed, he passed the woman he had tried to humiliate. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Kiana just watched him go, her face unreadable. As the cabin door began to close again, the relief pilot stepped on board, a young woman who looked at Kiana with a mix of awe and respect. Ready to go, Ms. Mckenzie? The new pilot asked. Kiana sat back down in 1A, picked up her book, and opened it to the page she had left off. Actually, she said, there's one more thing we need to take care of before we push back. The cabin fell silent as Kiana stood once more. She walked down the aisle, past the first-class curtain and into the main cabin. The passengers in economy were whispering, their heads bobbing like buoys in a choppy sea. They had heard the announcement, but they didn't know the full story. Kiana stopped halfway down the aisle, her eyes searching the rows until they landed on an elderly woman sitting in a cramped middle seat, her knees pressed against the chair in front of her. Ma'am? Kiana said softly. The woman looked up, her face lined with years of hard work, her eyes tired but kind. I noticed you were struggling with your bags earlier. And I think you deserve a bit more room for this long flight. Oh, I'm fine, dear, the woman said, her voice shaky. I'm just going to see my grandson in London. It's a long way, but I'll manage. No, Kiana said, reaching out to take the woman's hand. You're going to sit in 1B. It's the best seat on the plane, and the champagne is excellent, if you're into that sort of thing. Terrence, please help this lady move her things to the front. The woman gasped, her hand going to her mouth. The surrounding passengers erupted into a spontaneous round of applause, the tension of the previous hour finally breaking. Terrence smiled broadly, the first genuine expression he'd worn all day. It would be an honor, ma'am, he said, gently lifting her small suitcase from the overhead bin. Kiana watched them walk toward the front, a small sense of justice warming her chest. But as she turned to follow them, a man in the back row stood up. He was tall, dressed in a nondescript gray hoodie, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. He had been quiet the whole time, but there was something about the way he held himself that made Kiana's internal alarms go off. Nice move, the man said, his voice low and gravelly. But don't think a little charity is going to fix the rot in this company, Mckenzie. Kiana froze. Who are you? The man didn't answer. He just tapped his temple and sat back down, pulling his cap lower. Kiana felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the plane's air conditioning. She hurried back to her seat, her mind racing. Who was he? How did he know her name? And what did he mean by the rot? She sat back down next to the elderly woman, who was currently marveling at the legroom, but Kiana couldn't focus on her book anymore. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick message to her security chief. Check the manifest for seat 44E. I want a full background check before we hit 10,000 feet. The plane finally began to taxi, the engines humming a low, powerful tune. But as they neared the runway, the lights in the cabin suddenly flickered and died. A strange, rhythmic thumping started coming from the cargo hold, a sound that didn't belong on a healthy aircraft. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, but it was frantic, barely audible over a screeching alarm. Mayday, mayday! We have a total systems failure. We're losing hydraulics. Brace for impact. The world turned upside down. Screams tore through the darkness of the cabin as the plane lurched violently to the left. Kiana felt the gut-wrenching pull of gravity as the nose of the massive jet dipped toward the tarmac. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling like yellow ghosts, dancing in the dim emergency lighting. Kiana grabbed the elderly woman's hand, her knuckles white, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Stay down. Heads between your knees. Kiana shouted over the roar of the wind and the screeching metal. The plane slammed into something, not the ground, but a heavy support structure at the edge of the runway. The impact threw everyone forward. Kiana's head hit the back of the seat in front of her, and for a moment, the world dissolved into a blur of gray smoke and red sparks. She tasted copper in her mouth and felt a warm trickle of blood running down her forehead. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a thick, heavy silence filled with the smell of jet fuel and burnt plastic. Kiana blinked, trying to clear her vision. The cabin was tilted at a sharp angle. Through the jagged hole where the galley door used to be, she could see the flickering orange glow of a fire on the wing. "Is everyone okay?" she gasped, her voice sounding far away. The elderly woman beside her was unconscious but breathing. Terrence was slumped in the aisle, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle. Kiana unbuckled her belt and slid out of her seat, her legs shaking. She had to get them out. The fuel could ignite at any second. She crawled toward the emergency exit, her hands stinging from the broken glass on the carpet. But as she reached the handle, a hand grabbed her ankle. She shrieked, kicking out blindly. It was the man in the gray hoodie. His cap was gone, revealing a jagged scar across his forehead. His eyes were wide and wild. "It wasn't an accident, Kiana," he choked out, coughing up thick, black smoke. "They knew you were on board. The override, it wasn't from the office. It was a hack." Kiana stared at him, her blood cold. Who would do this?" "The people who really own this airline," the man whispered, his grip tightening. "You were just the face, Kiana. You were the decoy. And now, you're the sacrifice." Before she could ask another question, a secondary explosion rocked the tail of the plane. The man let go of her ankle as a wall of fire erupted between them. Kiana scrambled for the door, hauling the handle up with every ounce of strength she had left. The door flew open, and the emergency slide inflated with a violent hiss. "Terrence! Get the passengers out!" Kiana screamed, reaching back to grab the elderly woman. She dragged her toward the slide, her lungs burning from the toxic fumes. She pushed the woman down the slide and turned back for the others. But in the smoke, she saw a figure standing near the cockpit. It wasn't the pilot. It was a man in a black tactical vest, and he was holding a suppressed pistol. He raised the weapon, aiming it directly at Kiana's chest. Kiana dove behind the first-class partition just as a muffled thwip sounded, and a bullet shattered the walnut veneer of the seat she had just been sitting in. She didn't think. She didn't scream. She acted on pure survival instinct. She grabbed a heavy glass carafe from the service cart and threw it toward the gunman, then scrambled toward the galley. "Go! Go!" she yelled at the few passengers who were emerging from the smoke. They didn't need to be told twice. They tumbled down the slide into the rain-slicked night. Kiana looked for the man in the hoodie, but he was gone, swallowed by the inferno at the back of the plane. The gunman stepped around the corner, his movements slow and deliberate. He was a professional. He didn't say a word. He just tracked her movement with the barrel of his gun. Kiana backed into the cockpit doorway, her heart thundering. She looked around for a weapon, any weapon. Her hand landed on the fire extinguisher mounted to the wall. As the gunman leveled his sights again, Kiana pulled the pin and squeezed the handle. A thick cloud of white chemical foam erupted, blinding the man. He fired blindly, the bullets thudding into the instrument panel behind Kiana. She lunged forward, swinging the heavy metal canister like a club. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening crack. The man went down, his gun skittering across the floor. Kiana didn't wait to see if he was dead. She grabbed the gun and ran for the slide. She hit the ground running, her heels sinking into the soft mud at the edge of the runway. Fire trucks were screaming toward them, their sirens a cacophony of hope and terror. She saw Terrence and the elderly woman huddled near a perimeter fence, and she sprinted toward them. "Ms. Mckenzie! You're alive!" Terrence cried, tears streaking his soot-covered face. Kiana didn't stop to celebrate. She looked back at the burning wreckage. The man in the hoodie's words were ringing in her ears. It wasn't an accident. She looked at her phone, which she was still clutching in her hand. It was dead. Completely fried. "We need to go," Kiana said, her voice hard as flint. "The people who did this are going to come to the hospital to finish the job. We can't stay here." "But the police," Terrence started. "The police might be on the payroll, Terrence," Kiana snapped. "Did you see that gunman? He had a corporate ID around his neck." "My corporate ID." Just as she spoke, a black SUV with tinted windows swerved around the line of fire trucks and headed straight for them. It wasn't an ambulance. It was a pursuit vehicle. Kiana looked around desperately. They were trapped against the fence. Over there, she pointed to a maintenance tunnel that led under the runway. "Run." They scrambled into the dark, damp hole just as the SUV slammed on its brakes where they had been standing. Kiana looked back one last time and saw the man in the gray hoodie emerging from the shadows near the tunnel entrance. He wasn't running. He was watching the SUV. And he was holding a detonator. The ground shook as a series of explosions ripped through the maintenance tunnel's concrete ceiling, sealing the entrance behind Kiana and her small group. Dust and debris rained down on them, but they were safe, for now. The man in the hoodie had stayed behind, and Kiana could only hope he'd taken the pursuers with him. "This way," Kiana whispered, her voice echoing in the narrow, lightless passage. She used the small tactical light on the gun she'd taken to guide them. The air was thick with the smell of mold and stagnant water. Terence was limping heavily, and the elderly woman, whose name they had discovered was Mrs. Gable, was clutching Kiana's arm so hard it was bruising. "Why are they doing this, dear?" Mrs. Gable asked, her voice trembling. "You're a good girl. You saved me." "I'm a threat to someone's bottom line, Mrs. Gable," Kiana said, her eyes scanning the shadows ahead. "I thought I bought an airline to change it. I didn't realize I was buying a front for something much darker." They emerged 20 minutes later in a deserted parking lot on the far side of the airport. The rain was coming down in sheets now, masking the sound of their footsteps. Kiana spotted a beat-up delivery van with the keys left in the ignition, a stroke of luck she didn't question. She bundled them inside and took the wheel, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She drove toward the city, avoiding the main highways. She needed to get to the one person she could still trust, her mentor, a retired judge named Elias Thorne. He lived in a fortified brownstone in Harlem, and he had the connections to find out who had hacked the flight systems. As they drove, Kiana's mind pieced together the clues. The captain's outburst wasn't just random racism, it was a distraction. He'd been told to cause a scene to keep her occupied while the malware was uploaded to the plane's computer. He was a pawn who had been sacrificed along with the rest of them. "They're behind us," Terence whispered, looking out the back window. Kiana looked in the rearview mirror. 2 pairs of headlights were gaining on them, weaving through traffic with a reckless disregard for safety. She floored the accelerator, the old van groaning as it pushed past 80 miles per hour. She dived into a narrow alleyway, scraping the sides of the van against the brick walls, then took a sharp left into a crowded market area. The pursuers were relentless. A bullet shattered the side mirror, sending shards of glass into Kiana's lap. She swerved to avoid a fruit stand, the van fishtailing wildly. "Hold on," she yelled as she slammed the van into reverse, ramming the front of the lead car. The airbag deployed in the pursuit vehicle, stopping it cold. Kiana didn't wait. She sped off, turning into a maze of side streets until she was sure they were clear. She pulled up to Elias's brownstone and practically threw them out of the van. The heavy iron gate opened, and they scrambled inside just as the second pursuit car roared past. Elias met them at the door, his face etched with concern. "Kiana? What in God's name happened? The news says your plane crashed with no survivors." "The news is wrong, Elias," Kiana said, collapsing onto a velvet chair. "But they're going to try and make it right very soon. I need your secure line. Now." Inside Elias's study, the walls were lined with leather-bound books that seemed to hum with the weight of secret history. Elias sat at a desk covered in monitors, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Kiana stood over him, her face cleaned but her eyes still showing the fire of the crash. Terence and Mrs. Gable were in the kitchen, being tended to by Elias's staff. "I found it," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, grim tone. "The hack came from within Skybound, Kiana. But not from the headquarters. It came from a hidden server in the Cayman Islands. A shell company called Apex Altitudes." "Who owns Apex?" Kiana asked, her jaw set. Elias looked up at her, his expression pained. "You do, Kiana. Or rather, your signature is on the incorporation papers. Someone has been framing you for years, setting up a paper trail of embezzlement and safety violations. The crash was supposed to be the final piece of evidence. A tragic accident caused by a CEO who was cutting corners to hide her thefts." Kiana felt the air leave her lungs. "It was the board of directors. They never wanted me there. They just wanted my money to bail them out, and then they wanted me gone so they could go back to their old ways." "It's worse than that," Elias said, pointing to a new window on his screen. "I've just intercepted a live feed from a secure bunker in Virginia. They're holding a meeting right now. They're voting to liquidate the company and claim the insurance money, $4 billion. Can you get me in?" Kiana asked. "In the meeting?" "Electronically, yes. But they won't listen to a voice on a speaker." "I don't want them to listen," Kiana said, a cold smile touching her lips. "I want them to see. Record everything, Elias. Every face, every word. We're going to give the world a front-row seat to a corporate execution." Kiana spent the next hour preparing. She put on a fresh suit, this one black, like a funeral shroud. She checked the gun she'd taken, making sure it was ready. She wasn't going to hide anymore. She was going to walk straight into the lion's den and tear it down from the inside. "Elias, if I don't come back, make sure Mrs. Gable and Terence are taken care of," Kiana said as she headed for the door. "Kiana, wait," Elias said. "You're going there alone? That's suicide." "I'm not alone," Kiana said, glancing at the monitor. "I've got the truth on my side. And I've got a little surprise for them." She took a private car to the Virginia address, a nondescript office building that looked like any other government contractor's headquarters. She bypassed the security with a bypass code Elias had cracked. She moved through the hallways like a ghost, her heart cold and focused. She reached the double doors of the boardroom and paused. Inside, she could hear the clink of ice in glasses and the sound of men laughing. She kicked the doors open. The laughter stopped instantly. 7 men in expensive suits looked up, their faces turning from shock to horror. In the center of the table was the chairman of the board, a man Kiana had once considered a friend. "Kiana," he gasped, his glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. You're supposed to be dead." "I'm sorry to disappoint you, Arthur," Kiana said, stepping into the room. "But I've always been a bit of a flight risk." The chairman, Arthur Sterling, a distant cousin of the disgraced Captain Vance, tried to stand, but his knees buckled. "Security! Get her out of here," he shrieked, his voice cracking. Kiana didn't move. She just leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed. "Security isn't coming, Arthur. They're currently being detained by a team of federal agents Elias Thorne called 20 minutes ago. And in case you're wondering, every word you've said in the last hour has been broadcast live to the Department of Justice and the 5 o'clock news." The board members began to panic, some trying to hide their faces, others frantically deleting files on their laptops. But it was too late. Kiana walked to the head of the table and sat in the chairman's chair. She looked at the men who had tried to kill her, who had treated her like a puppet and then tried to burn the theater down with her inside. "You thought you could use me," Kiana said, her voice echoing in the sudden silence. "You thought you could buy a black woman's face to cover up your crimes and then discard her when she started asking too many questions. You thought I was just a diversity hire with a big bank account." "We can talk about this, Kiana," one of the board members pleaded. "We can give you a bigger share. 10 billion. Just tell the feds it was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," Kiana repeated, the words tasting like ash. "That's what your cousin said right before he tried to ruin my life. It seems prejudice runs in the family. But here's the thing about misunderstandings, they usually end with someone paying the price. And today, the bill is due." Just then, the windows of the boardroom shattered as tactical teams rappelled down from the roof. The room was flooded with light and noise. Kiana sat calmly as the board members were forced onto the floor and handcuffed. She watched as Arthur Sterling was led away, his face a mask of pure, impotent rage. As the room cleared, a man in a gray hoodie stepped through the broken doorway. He was battered and bruised, but he was alive. He looked at Kiana and nodded slowly. "Who are you really?" Kiana asked, standing up to meet him. "Internal Affairs," the man said, showing a badge that was bent and charred. "I've been trying to bring these guys down for 3 years. I didn't think you'd make it off that plane, Mckenzie." "Neither did I," Kiana said. She walked to the window and looked out at the city below. The sun was starting to rise, casting a golden light over the skyline. She had lost her airline, her reputation was in tatters, and she had almost lost her life. But for the first time in her career, she felt truly free. "What now?" the agent asked. Kiana turned back, her eyes bright with a new kind of fire. "Now," she said, "I think I'm going to start a new company. One where the pilot actually looks at the manifest. And I think I'll call it Justice Air." She walked out of the boardroom, her heels clicking on the marble floor with a steady, rhythmic confidence. She had survived the fire, and now she was ready to soar. But as she reached the elevator, her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. She answered it, and a voice she didn't recognize spoke one sentence before hanging up. "You think it's over, Kiana? This was just the first flight. Welcome to the turbulence." The elevator doors closed, leaving Kiana in the silence of the rising sun. What would you do if you realized your entire success was a trap set by the people you trusted most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and hit that notification bell so you never miss a chapter of this high-stakes journey. See you in the next one.